recording. There we go. So today I'm going to tie a balanced leech. And this is a pattern that has come around through Brian Chan and Phil Rowley over the years, I think, mostly. And what it looks like in its regular form is like this. It looks like the Bruised Leech that Phil Rowley came up with, but it's tied on a jig hook. So there's the eye of the jig hook is actually back here. And the idea is to put some weight on the jig hook in front of where the eye of the hook is. And then by suspending your fly from that, it'll be upside down this way. If you get the balance right, if you're fishing particularly under an indicator, the fly, instead of as if it normally hangs like this as a regular fly, when the line goes up and down or the bobber goes up and down, it goes up and down like this. Whereas with this balanced approach, when your bobber goes up and down, it goes up and down like this, which gives a more attractive pattern for the fish to come. So the way you start with is a jig hook, and I'm using one that's actually a fairly short shank hook. You could probably find that jig hook that's a little longer. This is a Hanak hook, and it has a extra long needle point, and it's actually the version that has a bent in point. So even though this is a size 10 hook, the gap is actually where the point is, but the actual bend of the hook is more like a size 8. So it gives you a little more room at the back. Now to balance it, you need two things. You need what's called a dressmaker's pin. Now Phil's originally, he used a regular straight pin, but you have to cut them. And it causes a spot on the shank that will cut your thread. So he found these dressmaker's pin. I don't know if you can see that. It's got a little head on it. Got to watch what size of beads you use for these because the head's quite small. And it's short. It's quite short. But the nice part is this entire thing of dressmaker's pin was like $4. Lifetime supply for $4. So then what you do is you take the dressmaker's pin and you put a bead on it. For this size of pin, at a 1/8 inch bead is just about right. This one's tungsten, and it adds some weight. So I got some orange ones. I got some shiny red ones. I've got some green ones that are a little bit bigger. And the trouble with the little bit bigger one is sometimes you need the very small eye to keep the head of the pin from going through. So I found a few. These are 3.5 millimeter beads. So they work too. So I pre-done the hook for a red one, and I've got a green one. And they balance a little different because the green bead's a little heftier. So the way to start this is you put your hook in the vise, and I'm using 8/0 thread because things can get a little bit cramped in places. And I will start the thread actually just where the shank bends down here. And I want to do a couple of wraps there because as with all hooks, when they close up the eye, they don't always close it completely. And so a couple of wraps down there keeps you, if you're using a really fine tippet, it keeps the tippet from getting snagged up on that rough edge of the end of the eye. So now what I'm going to do is just wrap my thread down the hook shank to where if it had a barb, the barb would be. And I need that in order to get the bead pin and the bead to sit on the shank and be adjustable. So now I'm going to bring this thing back up to right where the bend is. And I take my bead on the pin, and I will lay the pin down on the shank with about, trying to put the bead about 2.5 to 3 bead widths in front of the eye. And I will do a few wraps, and before I finish tying that off, I will compare it to the one that I did the adjustment on to get the distance right. So that's about right. The bead is about the right distance in front. And when you put the bead on, the other thing I should remember is that most of these fly fishing beads have a big end and a big hole on one end and a small hole on the other end. What you want to do with this is you want the big hole to be facing forward, because then it covers the head of the pin. Okay, so when I get that on there, I will cinch it down there and wrap it really good. Now, how do I know that I have the right distance of the bead in front? Well, I'll tie it on without doing a whole whack of wraps behind where the point of the pin is. And then I'll take this little piece of wire that I made up. It's really fine electrical wire, electronic wire, and make a little handle out of it. So you see, I've got something to hang on to, and it's got a little hook at the bottom end. And what I'll do is I'll put that point of that hook through the eye of the hook, and you'll see it's balancing with the bead head down a little bit. And that's about where I want it, because the rest of the fly is going to counterbalance. So I want the eye of the bead of the hook to be just pointing down a little bit, because the weight of the other material will kind of balance it off. So once I take the one that I've already done as a precursor to get the balance right, and that's about right. So once that's there, what I'm going to do is carefully wrap just in behind where the point of that pin is, and wrap up over that pin so that it cinches it in without nipping your thread on the sharp point of the pin. Make sure I have thread all the way down there. Then I'll bring my thread up on the pin to right behind the bead, and I'll build a little dam of thread. The idea of that is I want this bead to stay right up at the front and not drift back on me over the pin. So that's pretty good. He's pretty much where he wants to be. And at
Dave,
this point,
is that like a little stick pin? Like a
yeah, it is.
pin?
It's called a dressmaker's pin.
Oh, okay. Good, thanks.
And then what I'll do is I'll do a quick whip finish there, because now that I've got this thing on there and I've got it all nicely balanced, I don't want the pin to slide anywhere or go anywhere. So I'll cut it off, and I'll prep a bunch of these up. I'll take my super weld, JB super weld that comes in this little bottle, brushable super glue. You can get that at Canadian Tire, actually. And just touch a little super glue on there. Now, take a few seconds for that super glue to set. So what I'm going to do is grab it with my little hooky thing here, and I'm going to put it to the side to set. Now I'm going to take the one that I had done that before, and I put that in my vise. So now I have so the super glue is set up. I'll attach my thread right behind the bent down jig eye, and I'll just make sure I have a good layer of thread, and then I'll bring my thread up to about an eye width behind the eye. This is where we'll start doing the tail of the fly. The tail is going to be this stuff. It's a black Marabou plume. And I like the plumes because they have nice, long, fuzzy bits off the stem. And I'm going to pull off, I like to have a pretty sizable tail. So I'll pull them all off to the side, pinch them like that, and then pull them off the stem. And that might be a little small. So I'm going to get another batch. Let's set that down for a minute. I'm going to get another batch of Marabou off the other side, even them up, pull them off, and then I'll line the tips up on the workbench in front of me into one decent sized bunch. If you have a good long plume, you can usually get one off in one go. So there's a good chunk of Marabou to be a tail. Now to put this on, I want the tail to be about the length of from the bead to the bend of the hook to stick out the back. So I'll measure that, grab it with my left hand, and lay it down where I would have the bend of the hook. Transfer my left hand up to where the thread is hanging. And that's where I'm going to tie down the Marabou. And then I will wrap over it down the hook shank all the way back to the bend of the hook. And I'll take this fuzzy stuff up at the front in behind the jig eye, and I'll trim that off. So now I have a bit of an underbody for this this fly made out of Marabou. I'm just going to catch the bits out of there so it's nice. Okay, so that put a whole bunch of Marabou on the floor, which missed my catch basket. Okay. So now what I need to do, I'm just going to make sure that's all nice and cinched down with a bit of thread. And I'll come to the back. And then I take a tool that if you guys don't have one, you should get one. This is dubbing spinner. And it's got these two little springy hook things, and it's got a fair bit of weight. And I will make a loop that's about a little less than maybe 3 inches long, which you can see I'm making one thread on either side of this, this spring. And I'll get it down here so it's about, I'd say, 3 inches long. Bring the thread back up to the shank of the hook. Do a couple of wraps in front. Bring the thread behind, do a couple of wraps behind. And then I'll take my thread all the way up the hook shank behind the bead. And at that point, I'm going to put in a half hitch. Get my bobbin rest up here and put my thread out of the way on the bobbin rest. Now I can work with this dubbing loop. And I'll stick my finger gently in the dubbing loop at the bottom to keep it separated when I'm doing this next process. And the body of this thing is Arizona dubbing. This is from Robinson's. $4 for a little package. It's a mixture. This one is called blue and black. It's a mixture of colors of semi-seal. It's a, you can see from the package that it's got a mixture of glistening parts in it. So I'm going to set that on the table and do the next little step, which is before I spin this all up, I need a little bit of flash on the tail. So what I'm going to do is take 2 or 3 strands of this really fine Flashabou. Just a couple of them there. And trim that off. Got to do this before, so I need to get my thread back here, about halfway down the shank. And I will put this around the thread, and I'll fix it down and wind it back down to where I started the dubbing loop and get my thread back up out of the way again. I should have done that before I made the loop. However, I can salvage. Now that I've got this Flashabou in place, I'll pull them up at the back here, all of the strands, and just cut them just a hair longer than the tail. That's the flash for the fly. Put my bobbin back where it belongs. And of course, my dubbing spinner has spun up the loop. So I'll have to undo the spinning on the loop so I have a loop again. There we go. Now what I do is I take the dubbing and I will take small batches of this and slide it into the loop. And I don't want to clump it too much. I want it to be spread out on either side of the loop. So as I pull it out, I'm going to try and stretch it out a bit so it's stretched out, not clumped up. And just slide it in the loop and get that up close. And I'll just keep doing this until I get a reasonable amount of thread. I don't want to get dubbing on here. I don't want it to be packed up too much. And what I'll do is as I go down the dubbing loop with more and more dubbing, I will try to get more material and longer material sticking out the sides as I go down the dubbing loop. Because what I want is to have a somewhat tapered dubbing rope. So you see it's gradually getting thicker as I go, or wider as I go down the loop. And at this point, I can take my finger out of the loop because it will be held by the dubbing spinner. And I'll get a reasonable amount of dubbing in here. So I end up with wider and more dubbing at the front, at where the dubbing spinner is, than at the hook end. And then the last thing I do, when I kind of get this relatively evenly distributed along there without any gaps, if I can avoid gaps. And then I'll put it down like so, and I will spin the daylights out of it. That's the beauty of these dubbing spinners and I'll just give it a little adjustment here because it's not quite even, and there's some places they're missing. And I will spin it again. And then just tidy it up a bit. And at this point, I use my rotary vise and I start at the back. And every time around, I have to miss the point of the hook. And every time I run a loop around the thread, I will pull the dubbing back towards the back of it so that I've got this dubbing material trending towards the back of the hook. And I'll try and build a gradually tapering body without gaps in the middle, where I get this dubbing material stroked towards the back. And just keep doing that every pass. And then when I get to the eye of the hook, make sure I get past the eye in the back and then over in front of the eye of the hook. And again, pull that stuff back and out onto the pin. I'm getting I just want to tease out a bit of the dubbing from the loop there. So I've got some long strands at the front. And I'll go right up to where the bead is. I want to keep it the spiky stuff sticking out. I don't want it too tight here. And then when I get all that done, I'll stretch it all back, thread back off the rest, and hold it up at the top, a wrap behind to cinch the dubbing loop down, and then I will do a couple of wraps in front, and I'll get my scissors and let go. Just trim off the rest of the dubbing and get the excess material out. anything that I've got left over, I'll stroke up with my fingers and put it back in the pack of dubbing. Now, before I go any further, what I want to do is make sure that my thread is in front of where the dubbing is there to force the last bit of dubbing back. And I want to, at this point, I've got my little magic stick that has Velcro on the end, and I will stroke all this stuff back like this, and use the teeth on the Velcro to pick out any dubbing material that is compacted in up against the body of the fly. So it goes really nice and fuzzy, particularly when I get to the front. Now, I did say that there was an option to put hackle on this. So you can do it without, and a lot of these are tied without the hackle. But I'm going to put a hackle on just to show you how it works. So I've got some saddle hackle. By the way, this is the package for my Marabou thing. And this is the saddle hackle. And I'm just going to take this pretty webby hackle here. So I'm just going to take one out. And I take it by the tip and stroke it back. And I want to use the stuff that is not overly long, but the stuff that's still stuff that's fairly soft. So strip back the hackle to expose the stem. And then these things again have a natural curve. I want the natural curve facing away from me. And I'll lay the stem down right behind the bead and go a couple of wraps there, pull it back, stem back a bit, and then let my thread hang and take my hackle pliers and grab this side. And as I wrap this hackle around, which my hackle pliers are not helping with, there we go. I'll use some wetted fingers and stroke that hackle back. And I don't need much. It's 1, 2, 3 is probably good. And thread in behind. And then thread in front. And trim it clean. Stroke all this stuff back like that. Create space behind the bead. And then I whip finish. And I kind of like the version that has the hackle. To me, it just makes it a little more like a woolly bugger. And because it's soft Marabou or soft hackle, it will, when it's wet, go backwards. Now we're not quite done. I've got a good finish there. I'm not going to bother gluing it down. But what I'm going to do is turn this thing upside down and pull all the material away from the eye of the hook and put my little balancing thing in here. And I'm going to double check the balance. Now this is going to, I know this is going to balance tail down, but not completely tail down. You can see it's just slightly head up now. So that's actually a good balance. Now, the last thing I'm going to do, I'll just disappear for a minute here because I got to get a cup of hot water.
Is that bead weighted, guys?
It's usually tungsten because the back end of the fly is
Okay.
quite heavy.
I just missed that part. I signed up. I had difficulty getting into the
Yeah,
to
and there
the,
are different schools of thought. Some people like them balanced forward. And then you certainly want tungsten and sometimes even put a bit of lead wire behind the bead.
Yeah, you can make it a little heavier, but and balance it perfectly. But I find you don't need to, because the soft material at the back of the fly is going to cause it to do this anyway. So now I take my fly and I put it into my cup of hot water and let it sit there for a minute or two. And then I'll take it out. Put my cup over here. And then I'm going to take my fingers and I'm going to shape this thing so that all those hackle fibers are streaming back around the hook point. Then I can take the little hook on. That helps me. That's the reason for the hook, is it helps me stick that in the hot water and without burning my fingers, which I have to be careful with. We had our hot water tank sprang a leak the other day. We had to get a replacement. And when they put the hot water tank in, it came from the factory set with the temperature of the hot water at 140 degrees, and that would scald you right off the bat. So I've had to go in and drop the temperature. Anyway, so once you've got it all scooched out, there is your balanced leech. And you can see how much it slims down. Now, of course, it'll puff out when you get it in the water, but it won't puff out completely. And that's why you get these long torpedo shapes once it's back in the water and it's wet again. And so that is your balanced leech, bruised leech. And the bruising is because it's that mix of blue and black in the semi-seal. And this is what happens when it goes dry again. But once it gets,
Dave?
beg pardon?
How do you fish it?
Typically a balanced one, you're going to fish it under a strike indicator. So if you haven't fished using strike indicators, which the guys here tend to troll, you could probably troll this. But if you were going to troll it, I wouldn't use a jig hook. I just put an eyed hook and make it to 2x long and tie it on a straight hook. But the balanced ones, you're fishing under an indicator. And again, you figure out what depth you want to fish them at. And you can kind of use where the drop-offs are in a lake and where the shoals are. And fish them anywhere from 8 inches to 3 feet off the bottom. And because it's hanging straight down from the indicator, if there's a little bit of surface riffle, the indicator bobs up and down, and that makes the fly bob up and down as well. And when it does that, it undulates. It doesn't just go up and down like this, it undulates. And that's why the balanced leech is so effective if you're under an indicator. And it does work. These things work really, really well. Very effective pattern. Fished a lot of those on Muir Lake. They work really well there. So there we go. I'm going to stop my highlight here. And we go back to the main screen. So there you go.
Good
Now
day.
it's Florin's turn.
On fishing balanced leeches too, you can simply tie it at the end of a dry line.
Yeah.
And let the wind basically swing it for you like a wet fly.
Yeah.
That's a tactic that you can use on a stream as well. Use the current instead of the wind. And it works. I tried both with and without a strike indicator on a stream, and I found that both worked very well. So but for a lake, yeah, I guess the typical thing is
it's one of those ones. Yeah, it's one of those patterns that if the lake has got just a little bit of a riffle of a wind, it's much more effective with a night indicator. because it does bob up and down. There you
Okay,
go.
so we're gonna try to tie a couple of Scud patterns that are fairly simple. The first one involves beads, dubbing, and I found a bit of resin on top makes it look nicer and gives it a smoother back and more of a crustacean appearance. So what I do is, what I have here is a size 10 curved hook. So this particular one, I believe, is a Hogan's hook. They make these extra heavy wire ones. So whatever weight you don't have by adding brass beads or tungsten, you know, the hook itself is quite heavy. Okay. And so the first thing I'm going to do is, I'm not a big fan of jumping thread over beads if I can help it. So what I'm going to do is I start the thread right behind the last bead, and I'm using 6/0 thread here because I want a little bit of bulk. This is deliberate. And I'm just going to eyeball it until the bead basically no longer slides over the thread bump. So I'm just going to have to build it up here a little bit. Ah, this feels good. So when I get to that point, I take my thread, I do 1 or 2 whip finishes, because this is not going to be protected in any other way, and cut it. And then take my glass bead and push it back against that thread. You can come back later with a bit of lacquer or something if you feel that this needs strengthening. Okay. So the plan now is to have the last bead more or less in line with where the barb of the hook was before I crushed it. And then start your thread again. In this case, I'm going to switch to slightly thinner thread, because this is going to make my life a lot easier. It's the same olive dun color, but this one is 8/0 instead of the 6/0 that I started with. Then I'm going to use some dubbing. You can use similar material to what Dave was using, which is this semi-seal. And this one is called Canadian olive. It's a nice blend of all kinds of colors, and it's fairly soft stuff. You can use some seal fur if you want more of a translucent look to your fly. And this particular pattern tries to stay a little bit closer to the one in Phil Rowley's book. And so I'm going to use some orange seal fur. If you don't have orange seal fur, just use some orange dubbing. It has to just be spiky enough that you can, when you brush it after the fly is finished, you get a nice kind of set of legs to your Scud. Now, seal fur is a little bit stiff, so it's not, oops. This is the problem with setting the camera a little too close. Sorry about that. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to start the dubbing process and I'm wiggling my thread, not because the hook requires it or anything like that, but because I have the camera a little bit too close for comfort. So try to avoid the point of the hook, get a little bit of dubbing in here, and then jump your thread. So push the bead back and jump with the thread in the next gap. Take another little bit of material. Dub it on the thread. If you're very good at this, you can basically do the dubbing only once and then do the fly in one go. But no problem, unless you're doing competitive fly tying or something like that. And then jump over the last bead and go in the last gap. You're not going to go to the eye of the hook. You're just going to finish off the fly basically right here at this point behind the last bead. So 4 of these little beads, I don't know, they're roughly They look to me like a 7/64 of an inch bead size. About 4 of these seems to be okay for a size 10 Scud hook. And by Scud hook, I mean this sort of, you know, the kind of the standard in my mind is the Tiemco 2457, for example. And there are many, many, many versions of that hook shape, but Tiemco, I think, was one of the first ones. The older, there were some Mustad Scud hooks that are pretty huge. A size 10 would be 4 times the size of this beast. So you don't want that, okay? So do as many whip finishes as you think is necessary to secure this properly. And then it's time for a little bit of cleanup. So the first thing to do is, so now you have this mess. So what I like to do at this stage is first pull down with my fingers to get things on either side. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to clean up the top of the fly. And then you can use a variety of tools. This is a really handy thing. It's a bit of Velcro stuck on a popsicle stick. And I've had this for years. Thank you, Michael. This is still from the batch you brought at the club one night, ages ago. I'm still using it. Very good stuff. So use this. You can brush your Scud a little bit and get these fibers out and a little bit longer. Pull down and then take the scissors and trim anything that's sticking out at angles you don't like, sideways, upwards, any of that stuff. Okay. So once you've got that reasonably clean, I'm going to do a bit of trimming again at the very end, but for now I just want to do this cleanup. So you have this. Then I take, oh, I'm not happy now. I can see on screen there's more sticking up. Okay. Using a softer dubbing than the silver might give you a smoother appearance to your fly. Okay. So then what I do is I take a bit of resin of the thick kind and dab it here on top. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to try to smooth it out and fill in any gaps that I see between the beads. Okay. Don't want to put too thick of a coat because you want it to cure properly. So after you put the resin on, and I also coated that thread at the back there, so now the beads are locked in place, nothing is going anywhere. Take the light and zap this. And now you can check the back and see if you're happy with what you have on the back of the fly. And if that is so, it's not perfect. There are still a few fibers sticking. And this can be improved at a later date if you're concerned about appearances there. Now it's time to give it a haircut. So what I'm going to do is, again, take my little brushing tool here and brush the legs. Now, the nice thing about it is that the dubbing is beautifully locked into the resin up top, so it's not going anywhere. Then I take my scissors and trim this in line with the point of the hook. Something like that. And go hunting for stray fibers that are pointing in funny directions. and they're a little bit longer than you want them to be. Side, there's a little bit of muck. Cut this off. Here. Okay. Whenever you're satisfied, you can stop doing this. You can tinker with this forever. You can just say, okay, good enough. And that's one of the patterns. The original pattern basically just calls for the orange dubbing, but no resin on top. Now this isn't quite as smooth as I would have liked it to be. So sometimes what I do is when I've done the trimming and everything is done and it looks okay from all the other points of view, you know, if I'm happy about the outcome, except for the smoothness of the back, it's an easy matter to just put a little bit more. Now you have to be really careful because you can overload this. Just a little bit to give it a final kind of a finishing coat. You can also try to put a very light coat of the thinner formulation. But I only have the thick one here, so that's what I'm going to use. So this was just a tiny little bit, and then zap this, and this will give you a nicer, smoother back. And that's the Scud, number 1. The number 2 pattern, which should have time to tie, uses a slightly different approach. And here the modification that I made is I added a little bead head. I had some olive colored brass beads, and I thought, yeah, that might not be a bad idea to use. So in this case, this is just going to be dubbed. Alternatively, you can use some crystal chenille in different colors. I tied some with pink. I have some pearl chenille as well. They look a little bit like this with a pink chenille and the Scud back. Okay, so let's see. The way Phil recommends in his book, so when I'm saying the book, I'm referring to the Stillwater Patterns by Phil Rowley, which is, I think, unfortunately out of print. That's a pretty good book. He recommends tying the Scud back at the beginning and let it hang forward, but because I have it on a spool like this, that's going to be inconvenient, so I'm not going to do that. So I'll just do it sort of the somewhat easier way from one perspective. So I'm starting by adding in the rib, which is going to be used to secure the shell back. So I go here a little bit into the bend of the hook, but not too far. Just kind of a little bit behind where the barb was before I crushed it. And at this point, I need to put on some dubbing. And again, I have choices of various materials. I'm just going to use the semi-seal that I showed you earlier, this Canadian olive color. And I'll get a pinch of this, dub it on the thread. I'm going slowly now because I have to navigate between the point of the hook and my camera, which is very close to the vise. If you're tying without a camera, this step would go a lot faster. Okay. Put a little at a time, always with dubbing, you know, less is better, because you can always add more, but it's a little bit more painful to take out dubbing. So again, I concern here is hitting the camera, which I just did. You know, shape the body as you like it. Go towards the front. Go to right behind the bead and stop. Then you're going to take this cut back and use whatever you have. I'm using this time, it's some kind of a pearly material that's dyed in a sort of a yellowish lime green color. And I cut the end of it. It's about, I don't know, 3/16 of an inch wide. What I did is I've cut a little tapered piece at the end, which should make it a little bit easier for me to secure this to the hook. So this is the only tricky part because I didn't do it as Phil recommended, which is tie this on before you tie the fly. But with the bead head, the bead always gets in the way of doing that sort of stuff. So it's not a convenient thing to do. So I'm trying to get away with putting this in at the end without building too much bulk. In a way, having a bead helps because there's always a gap behind the bead. And so the risk of ending up with too much bulk at the head of the fly is much lower. Okay. So now what I've got is I've pulled back the Scud back over the back of the hook. Okay. And now before I do anything else, I need to release my wire and let it hang down. Things are going to get a little bit twisty here, so I just have to be careful. I need to also unwind a little bit of wire. If you just have a cut piece of wire to work with, of course, everything is going to be a little bit easier for you. So pull this back. I put my fingernail down to hold the Scud back in place and then secure it with the wire. And then I let the material just kind of hang there. It actually sticks to the vise with a magnet. And then go and wind the ribbing evenly and make sure you kind of, guide the wire a little bit with your finger so that when you tighten, you also hold a little bit that shell back so it doesn't end up twisting on you as a result of the torque from applying the rib. So here at the head, a couple of turns on one side and then a few more turns. Here you can do a few more in front of the wire so you can just helicopter it away and be done. Okay, go on. Now I want to cut this off and I'm just going to leave a little bit of a tag there. Okay, so just a little tag. And we're ready to finish this fly. So take the thread, whip finisher, whip finish. The whip finish is actually, in this case, it's overkill because I'm going to use the resin. Okay, so this is the almost finished fly, and a little bit of trimming and, prettifying is going to be next. Now, what I want to do again is the same issue. I want to make sure I don't have fibers sticking up. This one should be a little bit easier because the shell back basically keeps the fibers pointing down, but not all of them. So you want to trim and cut anything that's pointing up. Inevitably, you'll miss some. It's not always very easy to see. And the other thing I want to do is I want to trim a little bit this tag to a point because it's a little too wide. Okay. So this is the fly. You can take it fishing now after a little bit of brushing. But because I do like this idea with the resin, it kind of improves the shape a little bit, at least to my eye. I'm going to do something similar to what I did last time. So again, take a little bit of this thick resin and whoops, dab it here on top. Okay, let it settle a little bit because it'll smooth itself out. I mean, it's thick, but it does flow. If I were to leave this here, I would end up with a big, ugly mess because this stuff flows. It's like an uncured epoxy. All right, ready to zap. Give it a zap. Now this particular plastic material that I'm using shines very nicely. It seems to be a very nice green fluorescent color under UV light. So I don't know, maybe that's why it was so expensive, because it was using some fancy dyes. Okay. Turn this off. This is nice and dry. And all that remains to do is to take again the little brush and brush a little bit of that dubbing to get the legs properly out. And if you find that the dubbing refuses to go, you can also take a little dubbing needle and pick away. Now your dubbing is locked in under that shell back. It's held by the wire together, so your risk of tearing out the thread and doing some real damage to this fly is almost nil. Okay, so even if the thread gives up, you've got the resin to hold it all together. Okay, and at this point, just a little bit of, there's 1 or 2 stray fibers here that I don't like the look of. I'll just cut those off and call it a day. There is a little Scud. I think the original name of these things was the pearl or pearlescent shrimp, I think. And this is pretty close to the original, except for the resin on the shell back. But I think, to me, that resin makes it look more shrimpy. And that's that. 11:58 on time and under budget.
Florin, one of the things I wonder about with putting the resin on the back of the fly is whether that extra weight there will cause it to flip over and ride the wrong way around.
Good question. However, if you ever watch Scuds swimming, they go each and every way. So sometimes they seem to be moving in the water. They don't have a very regular movement in the water. So I don't know, but that's a very good question, whether that's going to unbalance the fly significantly.
I think if you're worried about that, one of the things you could do is use a small non-slip loop to tie that onto your line, and then it'll swing around on the loop rather than necessarily invert.
Now, this particular fly might not invert because it is a very heavy wire hook.
Yeah.
So if you look at this hook, the weight that's past the last wrap of wire, right? That's kind of where the resin ends, right here.
Yeah.
So if I'm thinking of the balance on this fly, the resin that's heavy on top is from here to here, and I tried to go gently on it. And then from here on, you've got this big piece of wire that probably does balance out more than balances out the. But this is to be tried. These are new. These are all new flies that I'm playing with and trying out. So speaking of experiments, here are the here's another silly looking bugger. Two
That
beads,
looks nice.
egg yarn in between them, and then the hot thread here, and then put a bit of resin on the hot thread. And I'm thinking I can just put a few of